Okay, welcome everybody to the latest Edify event. My name is Glenn Marshall. I'm co-principal at Northern Baptist College. We're the college behind Edify Learning. If you want to find out more about Edify, then there are various places you can find us. You can find us on YouTube, Edify Learning. You can find us on Twitter, Edify Learning. Also on Facebook, or if you want to head across to the Northern Baptist College website, there's a page there that tells you about what we're doing, and in particular about a forthcoming pilot course that we're starting in the autumn, helping leadership teams of churches and other Christian organizations to engage with the whole question of how do we engage in corporate discernment? What does it mean as a collective to hear the mind of God? So that's me, that's Edify, and now on to the important stuff, which is my guest for today, who is the Reverend Dr. Robert Beamish. Hello, Rob.
Hello.
Rob's going to be very kindly kind of having a bit of a conversation with me this afternoon about the whole area of preaching in times of crisis, in times of disruption, and we'll tease that between ourselves for, probably 15 minutes or so. But Rob, before we get into that, it'd be good if you could just introduce yourself to the folk who are tuning in, please.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to be here with you for this conversation. So I'm Rob Beamish. I'm the Baptist minister of Princess Drive Baptist Church in Colwyn Bay. I've been here since 2007. I'm married to Louise with 2 children, and I'm also a hub tutor with Northern Baptist for the Light College, which is based broadly out of Chester. And my kind of journey that began kind of in ministry training from age 21, so over 20 years now, has kind of pursued some kind of themes in terms of ministry and kind of practical theology and congregational studies. And I suppose I'm here because my doctoral studies, which I finished a few years ago at King's College London, focused on preaching in times of crisis, which is quite a niche field in a sense in terms of homiletics, in terms of preaching. And at the time that I was writing and researching, there was only really one major treatment of that. And it came about for me because I went to a funeral where the minister really just wanted to bring hope and didn't really do anything in terms of grappling with the kind of grief that people were feeling, and made lots of promises that they couldn't hold to. And I just felt we've got to think through not just about funerals and death, but how we speak of God in moments of crisis. And during the whole kind of pandemic, I just have had opportunity to talk more about this and have been asking Baptist ministers and others what they're doing. I've been looking online, and it's been really interesting to see how Baptist ministers, but more broadly the church, has responded to this moment. So finding my doctorate has some use, perhaps.
Wonderful.
We shall see. I look forward to the conversation.
Not many people have that blessing, Rob, so
No.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I suppose it's the joy of doing practical theology, at least if it's congregationally based. You've got a chance of it being relevant, hopefully.
Okay, well, tell you what, we'll be the judge of that in 15 minutes' time, shall we?
Absolutely, yeah. Don't turn off.
Right, so it's good to be able to draw on your sort of kind of specialist area of research, and that sense that this is also up-to-minute research that's been going on just these past few months, even as you've turned towards looking at the whole COVID-19 lockdown and in what sense that's a crisis. So you've already given us 2 examples of what we might mean by crisis. You've referred to the COVID-19 situation, referred to a funeral situation. Could you just say a little bit more, Rob, by way of getting into the topic, that when you speak about crisis, or sometimes I've heard you use the language of disruption, what kind of crises do you have in mind?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And it might seem an obvious one, but we often talk about crisis or there being issues that we're facing. But when we think about preaching, I think it's important to understand that preaching, our sermon, our communication can be shaped or formed by the events in which we are speaking in around us and the people that we're speaking to. So I think it's helpful to say, yes, some moments are a moment of crisis. So obviously my doctoral studies, which had to be quite focused on those moments for the preacher when they stand up, whether on a Sunday or another event, and it could be a funeral or even a wedding or something else, where you know that you have to depart from either what you've already prepared or what might already be expected. And so that crisis can take lots of different shapes or forms. It could be just there's been a series of deaths in the church congregation, or it could be something very local, the church minibus crashes, people get injured. It could be something that's more global or national, terrorism. There's also the sense then of social crisis. It can be an individual event, but then the idea of something where actually this is an ongoing issue. So we could talk about issues of injustice or race. And I think COVID-19 would come under idea of social crisis. So it's about individual events that are bringing crisis for people, as well as something a lot bigger as well.
So it's a whole range of things, but it's got a particular eye on the fact that as preachers, we need to be responding to our context, and sometimes that context is focused on particular crises. There's a little line that I sometimes use with students at Luther King House, which is that all sermons must come with a postcode and a date stamp. They're never addressed to whom it may concern. It's very much to do with the here and now, the preaching. Is that fair, do you think?
Absolutely, because I've done some work on kind of digital religion as well, which kind of, in a sense, because all the move to being online as church and our communication has all dovetailed together a bit. And I think there's something there about what happens when sermons are recorded, and that whole idea of preaching as event and that moment. And I think to recognise, and I suppose you put it quite succinctly, that actually it's simply recognising that preaching isn't in any kind of vacuum. Yeah. And so you can't just ignore the crisis. And some of the stuff I've read, some of the problems come when a preacher just ignores the crisis. I do know of some churches where COVID-19 wasn't mentioned for weeks and weeks, when everyone's sitting there in the pews going, or on screen going, please tell us, speak to us about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Not many sermons end up being remembered, do they? I'm pretty sure that very, very few of mine have been remembered by people who've heard them. I'm not too bothered about that. I think that's fine. There's one that really does stick in my memory that I heard that was preached on the Sunday after 9/11 had happened. And it was a preacher. I heard it on a cassette tape. It's that long ago.
Oh, wow.
A preacher who responded to that context, which is clearly a crisis, by drawing links between the events on the news and the fall of the temple in Jerusalem.
Wow.
Incredibly powerful linking of the scriptures and the immediate here and now crisis. So I suppose from one point of view, preaching into crisis gives us that potential to have a particular impact that might not be the case just on routine, regular preaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's been that, Eugene Lowry and others said we needed to introduce tension into our sermons. We needed to create a moment of tension, that kind of method where you raise something that then has to be resolved. In crisis, the tension's already there. That's why if you don't acknowledge it, that's more of a problem. And I think it forces us to be bold. And simply so I think it's such an opportunity just to engage.
Okay, so there's the potential for impact because that tension, as you say, is forced upon us by the circumstances. Okay, can you just reflect with me for a while on other ways in which preaching in crises differs from our more usual, settled, regular, routine preaching? So what's different about preaching in crisis?
Yeah, I mean, if it was kind of Fosdick that said the whole, as he started off the whole kind of therapeutic kind of counselling movement or project method of preaching, kind of said people don't come to church, ready to hear about the Jebusites. That's not why they're there. They bring with their own issues. And I think that is, as we've already hinted at, is what Crisis Moments is about. People come with wounds and grief and with issues that need to be addressed. So therefore, our preaching has to find some way to connect with those hopes. And so I think, and it's that question about, I think you might agree that it's the separation between preaching and teaching. And it's simply about proclamation of God. I've been quite concerned that we have confidence, even when our own confidence in God may have been rocked by something which has just happened to us or around us, but confidence to name God in the midst of that moment. So that might be really urgent in a way that maybe it isn't always, because people are there in quite a settled place, but they're unsettled, they're disrupted. Yeah.
And there's a real tension there, isn't there, Rob? It seems to me, because I've occasionally found myself thinking, who am I to be disrupting this pain with my words? I think it was Australian sociologist that I was reading when I was doing a master's degree in the 80s, A.D. Gilbert, who said something that stuck with me ever since then. He said the graveside is the worst place in the world to justify the ways of God to human beings. And there is something, isn't there, do you think? I certainly feel it, a tension that when there's a major crisis going on, almost the most appropriate response feels as if it should be just being silent and being quiet in the face of that, lest our words fail to land home.
Absolutely. And there was that I mentioned before, that little book that David Bentley Hart wrote after the tsunami in 2005 called The Doors of the Sea, where he just kind of says that sometimes, we just have to be quiet. But the tension is we know we must speak. Yeah. And so, and we all know the damage, whether it's happened to us, the damage of when people just try and make things better with their words. And as you said, say certain things about God and try and justify something. And you think actually that justification actually does damage to the memory of what has been lost. And as in fact, is actually, well, we think we're bringing hope, but actually we're bringing poison, or we're disrupting. We're not allowing the disruption to be solved. We're just bringing more disruption because we're just scrabbling around for something in the midst of the moment.
So a real tension between the temptation to stay silent, the fear of speaking words that hurt rather than help, and yet that, I don't know what the word is, but it's that sense of burden, that sense of must, that sense of being commissioned, as you were saying, to name God, to speak of God, because there's a part of me feels if we stay silent and we don't venture and we don't risk the words, there's almost something atheistic about that, isn't there? That as if we can't speak of God in that context, which can't be right.
Absolutely, or we're embarrassed by what we think God has or hasn't done. And I think that's so often the reason why perhaps, we can talk about therapy as a therapy society. And I mentioned that illustration of going to a funeral where we want to bring hope, but actually I don't think that hope comes without cost. And I think we've got to have a space in crisis preaching. And that is why I think, as that first question said, that it is a distinct genre. We do need to think about what we do in crisis, because we have to be prepared to deal with the actual truth of the reality of the situation we're in, and then have the courage to name God. But then if we're not sure who we think God is ourselves, if we're not sure about how we can talk of God, the words we can use of God, then actually we're going to struggle. So it demands a lot of our theology, I would say, or our doctrine of God. Those moments.
And I guess a kind of a certain element of personal courage as well, or kind of trust that God will compensate for our failings and our weak and feeble words, that somehow by the grace of God something might happen whereby God's voice is heard despite us sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I think because it's such a beautiful moment, because there can be an arrogance in a model. I'm sure it wouldn't be the case in your preaching, Glenn. I have heard it, and hopefully not in mine. But some people do want the preacher there to tell them exactly what to think and exactly what it is. And if we think we have to have all the answers and that we're trying to solve something, I mean, David Bentley Hart talks about the problem of theodicy, of the problem of evil, that sometimes we can have great descriptions and great ways to solve the problem, but actually when we bring them into a moment of pain, pastorally, they do that damage that I spoke of, because they might be great on the page, but they mean nothing when they don't take the pain away. And it's a real challenge for us to do something quite beautiful, which is join together in the pain of the moment and say, who is God and where is God in the midst of this?
And I wonder if sometimes, Rob, we've talked, and I suspect we see this similarly, about the importance of insisting on God and God's presence, which ultimately has to be a healing presence, ultimately. If there's a tension between that speaking of God and insisting on God, and the risk that preachers sometimes run of wanting to be the voice of God to the congregation. Whereas I wonder if sometimes in crisis, it might be legitimate for preachers to be the voice of the congregation to God. That we kind of articulate something of the congregation's pain to God, preaching as lament, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember hearing John Bell from the Iona community years ago talk about the lost language of lament. And if anything, in my kind of privilege I've had of looking at what people have been preaching, people have been sending me their scripts and things, lament, and looking at kind of issues of exile in the Old Testament, and whether it be Jonah or Lamentations, Jeremiah keeps cropping up in what people are doing. Just that which gives us permission to name our pain before God, but remains hopeful.
Right.
Which just, I think, prevents us from, there are many traditions, and even in a sense my own included, that can want to focus on the victory of what we've gained from God. But there is something very bold about saying, actually, at this moment, I am, with like Philip Yancey, I am disappointed in God, and I need to have some way to structure that, and some forum to work through that together. So I think it's beautiful to see it as a journey together, and to allow the congregation to set the agenda.
And in some ways, that's still, isn't it, an articulation of faith in God. Even if we're articulating pain and disappointment to God, we're doing it to God. We're doing it with God. So it is this insisting on God and expressing, we may not have the perfect words, we may not have the answers, but you are God and we are your people, and we must deal with you, we must address you. So, sorry, go on, Rob.
No, just saying, for me, it's moving through the pain to the promise. But if you don't name the pain and be honest with that, and actually then the promise doesn't have the worth. If I haven't had to wait for the present, and now I can buy what I want within reason, it's not quite as fun as having to wait for it or save up for it. Sometimes I think we, in a sense, in those moments, we panic and we, in a sense, discharge the gospel too early, and it doesn't have the impact or the power.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting image, discharging the gospel too early, kind of going half cocked.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, well, the thing you've got in your backpack, and I've got hope, and here's the hope, but it's like, well, I'm not quite sure what shape this hope needs, and how this hope is going to fit in with where I'm currently feeling. And that's what Lamentations, I mean, the fact that the first 4 chapters are so, they're acrostics, the first 2 are palindromes, real order put into the chaos, whilst they're expressing some horrendous truths of what happened. And I think that's what our preaching does. It names the truth, but it brings order into the chaos.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's very helpful. Maybe just one last question, if I can, about this general area of what does it mean to preach in crisis, and then we'll come to think specifically about the particular crisis of COVID-19 and the lockdown and the way in which that has been disruptive to us. I'm just interested to know, because I think I've heard you touch on this before, about the possibility that here we are, we've talked so far as if we're the people in pain, and there's God, whose name we speak or to whom we address our pain. Do you think it's legitimate for us to sort of see that God himself might be hurt, affected, disrupted by the crises that affects us as his people?
Yeah, I mean, that is when some of the issues that are around about disappointment with God are something often about the sense that God is far away, and either God isn't interested, or we'd say, like the problem of evil, don't we, that if you had the power to change a situation but then you didn't change that situation, and surely that is actually the response of someone who is evil and calculating in a way we wouldn't comprehend. And that's the same thing here, in that moment, that we're trying to kind of say, well, is God emotionally involved? It's not just that we might say, well, God is transcendent. And that's been the shift, hasn't it, in terms of the theology, in terms of what's called impassibility or passibility. Does God change, or does God suffer? So immutability, does God change? Impassibility, does God suffer? These kind of classic ideas. And I'm, I suppose, controversial for some, because I still hold to impassibility, whereas from the Holocaust, from the Second World War, particularly Mortman and others really said you can't really talk about a God who is impassible after those horrific events. And I think it's the same thing as we see horrific events stack upon horrific events. But I'd want to argue that just holding that God doesn't suffer or God doesn't change doesn't mean that God isn't emotionally engaged. And obviously we can point, there's leaps on the way, but we can point to the incarnation and say, well, okay, where does the cross figure in the half of, in the middle of this, perhaps.
So if in Christ we see God incarnate, and if that God does not suffer, why did Christ weep?
And it's this idea of emotional engagement. But then I've often said, look, if I go to the doctor, I want the doctor not to break down in tears, just like I would if they've got bad news. I want them to not necessarily just fix it, but I want them to have the capacity to do that. And Frances Young, church historian, you may have come across her, and she talks about her disabled son in a great bit of narrative theology about her son, saying, actually, I need God to be the ocean of love that absorbs my pain and suffering, but can do something about it. He says, I don't need God, in a sense, just powerless next to me in the same way that I'm powerless. And I think that's what we wrestle with. Christ weeping, and Christ weeping at the tomb of Lazarus, and all those images of God with us in the midst of our pain.
Yeah, we must be careful not to pursue this too far, because we could spend the rest of the time talking about this.
Yeah, I'm conscious I've kind of glossed over that. When you try and make something,
that's great.
Open tears and everything else, you try and make it simple and you make it more complicated. Absolutely.
I just want to affirm that idea that it seems to me, and this is important in crises, isn't it? Because we are acutely aware of our own pain, and we're tempted to wonder how God, not just what answers God has got to that, but how God reacts to that and responds to that. And I'd want to insist that there's a significant difference between being impassible and impotent. That God can suffer with. God can feel our pain, God can be affected by our pain, but that doesn't mean to say that God's impotent to respond to our pain. Anyway, let's not chase that too far.
Okay. I was about to mention empathy, because that's the big thing, isn't it? It's God empathetic. But yeah.
Great, yeah. Good. Okay, let's.
I kind of raised it and then backed off. There we go.
Yeah, you back off. I'm backing off as well. I'm backing off from all kinds of questions in my head, just because it would be too interesting that it's good for us. We'd have a great time, but the people listening in sort of might get a bit fed up eventually. So let's move on then to just bring it home in terms of the particular crisis of the last few months. As I say, I've heard you in other places use the language of disruption, and there's no doubt about it. What's happened to us has been disruptive, and you said that you've been looking at examples of preaching primarily from Baptist preachers, is that right?
Yeah, primarily. And obviously you come across others and other churches, but I particularly asked, as the Baptist minister, what Baptist preachers and leaders have been preaching at this time. Yeah.
And what kind of issues then do you think the crisis of the lockdown and the whole COVID-19 thing has presented to preachers? And those who have to listen to preachers preaching at them as well, for that matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's raised, I suppose, two main things, actually, I would say. The first main thing is perhaps the obvious one, which is about then how do we communicate our preaching, because suddenly the buildings were shut and people couldn't gather. So obviously all the talk has been of digital religion and the shift to kind of online culture, and people grappling either with online or with newsletters and Facebook. And I suppose preachers have simply had to think through all the talk about form and communication and how long they preach for and all of that. And because I think in homiletics, all the homiletics books are obsessed by form. Most preachers, I don't think, are obsessed by form in the same way. They're not thinking, I'm moving from this shape to this thing and this thing. Whereas suddenly we've been forced to say, actually, how am I going to communicate in a way that actually maybe is perhaps different for us if we've been used to preaching longer or shorter. And then I think, secondly, the thing is about, as this has gone on, because I think I hinted at the beginning, crisis as an individual moment, but also the crisis that goes on. And actually, how much do you let the crisis come into your regular pattern of being church? Once you've addressed it, once you've named it, the kind of compassion fatigue that comes part of trauma studies, for people where they think, gosh, I can't deal with it anymore. And Karl Barth talked about this when he was preaching in the midst of war, and someone telling him off for letting the war rage on in his sermons, but he forgot the gospel. And I think there's that tension. So a long answer, but those two things about, I think, the onlineness and then the fact, how do we carry on? What are we going to say as this isn't stopping at this point?
Yeah, because you can't turn up every week on people's screens and sort of saying, oh, COVID-19, isn't it terrible? You've got to have more than that to say.
Yeah, and I suppose it's not about how do you say that in different ways, but you're saying the same thing. You just, so it's how I've seen people be very courageous in trying out new stuff, but also, very creative in terms of that. And I think, and perhaps grappling with that which is unfamiliar. People dipping into Jeremiah or the Psalms of Lament. We went through Jonah, which was great. It's what Tim Keller preached after you mentioned 9/11 in New York, and actually found Jonah very rich for talking about who is our neighbor. And it came at the time, obviously, as the social racial unrest in America and the protests, here in the UK as well. Jonah asked the question, "Who is our neighbor?" Because he was refusing to go to his neighbors because he didn't actually like the fact that God was going to be compassionate or could be compassionate to them. And so I think all those questions, we're being forced perhaps into unfamiliar territory and texts that perhaps we're not used to preaching, especially, and then not used to preaching them in a different kind of online context.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned there that you've seen sort of kind of some encouraging examples of people responding creatively to the context. Have you got any other examples of how that's, the ways in which people have taken seriously this different medium of preaching?
Yeah. And I think and the big thing is, the temptation for all of us, even now as I stare at the Zoom screen, is just to keep on talking. And I think you've had more experience of this, that moving towards more interactive, even kind of round table, like John McClure, approaches to preaching. I think it's forcing us to say, look, I can't keep talking for 20 minutes staring at a screen. Actually, it gives us opportunity for people to be more involved. Yeah. So what that's been like for you?
Well, it's really interesting, Rob, because I've lived with a certain disconnect for a number of years now, so I've kind of been convinced that I remain committed to the value of monological preaching. I think when it's done well, it can be a great gift to the church. But I think it's probably occupied more space in our liturgy than it's a right to. And I think there's room for encouraging more methods of multi-voice preaching, of dialogical preaching. But I've never been very good at getting congregations to do it or helping them to do it. I've had a number of goes at it, and sometimes they've worked reasonably well, but often not particularly well. But what I have noticed with my own church here in Manchester, small congregation of, the numbers on a typical Sunday would vary between about 20 and 40, I think, is one of the things that's happened as we've met for worship online. It's become much more conversational. People relax, I think, because they're sitting at home, they're laid back, they've got their casuals on, they're not sort of in a public space, they're in a private space. They seem to be more at ease, and so they're ready to respond. We've used things like breakout rooms as part of sermons, which is easier to do online, isn't it? Because you hit a button. You don't have to get up and move out and go down the corridor into the Sunday school room at the back and then discover that the Sunday school class is still there after all, so you can't do it. So that's worked well. And the other thing that I've seen done, which has been interesting, is people using the chat box while the preacher's been preaching. So the preachers invited comments in the chat box as they've been talking. I've done this myself a couple of times, and then tried to respond to what's coming up in the chat box, either during the sermon or a little bit safer at the end of the sermon to pick up on the questions that have been going. And I just, that's been fascinating in a sense. Unwanted disruption has allowed me to do more effectively things that I struggled to do before the disruption came along.
Yeah. Yeah, because I had this line about disrupting the disruption by declaring the great disruptor, which isn't just trying to have all the D's, but it's that sense of you meet the disruption by actually embracing the disruption. And I think there's a book in 2004 by Meg Rossoff, a young adult novel called How I Live Now, which is about a situation in a fictional Third World War, where a character is suddenly thrust into a situation she wasn't expecting, and she reflects on how she's living now compared with how she lived before, and actually how she hopes to live in the future. And I found that idea of how I live now really interesting for trying to kind of free me from saying, well, and even as we look to maybe go back into buildings and do different things, that it's not just about this. I find this irritating narrative about the new normal and everything has to be different, because actually I like the body of Christ, and I like the body of Christ meeting, and I like monological preaching, and I agree with you, and I like seeing the whites of people's eyes. But also, as you said, this is forcing us to be creative, and even live streaming through Facebook or YouTube, Instagram, people are making comments, people free to make comments. And I think people feel engaged with it. That's back to the whole point about the tension doesn't have to be created by us. We don't have to interest them in what happened in the exile, because I think, gosh, I do feel like an exile at the moment, or I can't leave my house. So I understand at Easter the limitations placed upon Christ. Suddenly there's something quite real for people. And I think it's just how we grasp some of that and just stay courageous.
So do you think there might be particular practical differences in your own approach to preaching whenever we get to wherever it is that we're going after this disruption?
I hope so. And I suppose maybe the question there, to put back to you, is about the difference between kind of the form of preaching and also the content of preaching as well. It might seem kind of obvious, but I think it's easy to fall back into patterns. We had a wedding here a few days ago here at the church, and even with social distancing, we kept everything in place, but people were back in the building, a small group, very hard to pretend that things were different. Everyone just got back into the old groove of interrelation and moving around the building. And I fear that might be something, we might lose some of the stuff. And I think we just need to kind of stand firm, but also not just throw out stuff for the sake of it. I think that's where I mean content, it has to have a purpose. It has to mean something. If it's back to insisting upon God, as you said, then let's start with that. And how am I best going to proclaim the good news of the gospel, or insist on God in this moment? And how is that best served for the people? But maybe have confidence that the people can take it. They can take different models. They've shown that they can do it then, so maybe they can do it now. I don't know if that's really an answer.
But, well, I think I find that a very hopeful answer. That we're not learning about how we preach, but we're learning more about the people to whom we preach, and that confidence in our ability to adapt and respond constructively to what we've been through. It's perhaps a good.
And as having the boldness to encourage them to think about not being passive receivers, even of a monologue, but actually they are part of shaping that in some way. That they are. I suppose the best monologue or monological preaching, as you say, actually draws us in. We're engaged. Like the best dramas have us on the edge of our seats. And I don't think with Lowry we have to go through movements and ooh and ah and all that. I do think we can simply, if we preach with integrity and with character and conviction, I do think that has to go a long way in terms of engaging people. We shall see. Yeah.
Good. So everybody down to Princess Road in a couple of months' time to see how it's done, eh?
Yeah, well, and if you teach preaching at all, or people look at you and go, "Really? You teach preaching? You should be better." People come and throw bananas and fruit at me and stuff, or toilet rolls. Actually, I could do with some. Throw toilet rolls at me if you can find them.
Well, I'll pop down to Tesco's and see you shortly. Well, that's been really helpful. Thank you. Fascinating. I could go for much longer, but let's be kind to those who are tuning in and leave them to chew over what you've had to share with us. Really appreciate it. And
thank you. Great to be here.
Continue to serve God through this important ministry.
No, thanks, good.
Take care.
God bless.